What's going on, everybody? My name is Nick Gomez Colon,
Nikos Myrogiannis Koukos.
and welcome to episode 2 of Out of This World, a deep analysis of the planets by Gustav Holst. Thank you for being here. Thank you so much to you if you checked out for episode 1 of our podcast. We are super excited to be keeping this going, and here we are with episode 2, looking at the second movement, Venus, the Bringer of Peace.
So you listened to the first episode of the podcast and you're still here for more? Wow, I'm impressed.
We are very thankful that you're here. So, just like last time, how this is going to work is I am a composition student here at JMU. Nikos is one of our doctoral conducting candidates for choral conducting. So we're going to be providing some of our own thoughts in terms of our own analysis. And just like we did with the first movement, we just listened to the piece. We're fresh off of it, have it fresh in our ears, and we're very excited to share some of our thoughts with you.
Okay, so let's start right away. Previously on the planets, the bringer of war, we were going down. We were defeated in a big battle. Now Venus is the only planet with a female deity name. So she is the bringer of peace, which is in direct comparison to the bringer of war. So she is the bringer of peace right away from the previous movement. Now we're going to discuss what is peaceful. So there is the word peace. How is that found into the music? What are the devices, the elements, the specs of the music that are peaceful? What is peaceful about that?
Absolutely, Nikos. And I think that's first presented to us with the very beginning of the piece. So, as always, if you're not familiar with the work, we highly recommend that you listen to the entire suite. We're going to have a link to the score that we use to analyze, as well as the recording that we use to analyze this piece in the description. So, be sure to check that out if you haven't already, if you're not familiar. So, right away at the beginning of this movement, we're presented with a horn solo, and which is immediately responded by very smooth, luscious chords in the higher tessituras of the woodwind instruments. So we have flutes and oboes playing very high chords, which is already in stark contrast to the beginning of the first movement, where we have all these low Gs and low strings and low brass. And I think one thing to kind of answer Nikos' question of the idea of peace in comparison to the first movement is throughout this entire movement, there's little to no use of the entire brass section apart from an occasional solo.
You know what? It's funny. It's so funny for this work. I always thought that the horn could be like a big brass war instrument, but used in the right way, like here, it's also very peaceful. It has a very peaceful color, like a timbre, like it's a very peaceful, like spiritual sound. What do you think? It's something. What do you think is the factor, the defining factor that makes such an instrument so peaceful and serene?
I think what makes it like serene and what makes it stand out the way it does is the choice of using it on its own. Because another piece that actually opens with a horn solo just like this is the Jurassic Park theme. So if you listen to the very beginning of that, it's a very similar idea where it's just a horn and it just has this really warm sound that's really portrayed when it's isolated like that. And you wouldn't get that sense of like warmth, and that isolated sound if it's playing with an entire section. So in the first movement, we heard like low G's, like pounding in that 5/4 rhythm, but now we just have the smooth, luscious chord or the smooth, luscious melody in the horn. And although like it is metered, it's marked adagio in 4/4 time. It almost has a sense of like rubato to it. At least that's how I personally hear it.
And also, it's carrying a very slow, at least a kind of slow, stepwise motion in the melody, which is just four notes going up, and there is the response from the woodwinds going down into chords. So there's kind of a call and response. And again, this is peaceful because of the instruments and their nature and the way we perceive their role into the biggest family, which is the orchestra. I just want to give you a beautiful pass here and say you were talking about. In the previous episode, we were talking about alienating sounds, something that it's not bad or aggravating, but it's something out of this world, as the podcast is named, actually. And so, what is outlandish about this beautiful choral response and those families of the instruments?
So, I think what's outlandish is just the texture Which I'll answer this in two parts. I'll answer it just on its own, and then I'll answer it in relation to the piece. I think on its own, like, we're presented with this very beautiful texture that, even though it's marked piano, because they're sitting so high in these woodwind instruments, it's going to be loud and heard no matter what. So we almost have this sense of like presence within it, no matter what dynamic you play it at. And being supported by the horn, which also can be its own loud instrument on itself. Like, we have that sense of like presence that like we don't really have, and this kind of leads me into my answer and how it applies to the piece. At the ending of Mars, the Bringer of War, it actually ends with a lot of orchestral hits, like we talked about in the first episode. But if you look at the score, you'll find that no woodwinds, apart from one note that bassoons and double bassoons play, are playing in that ending. It's just all brass and all strings playing very marcato. Whereas this opens up completely on the opposite end of the spectrum with long, smooth legato phrases and with that section of woodwinds that we were missing from before. So it really plays into the contrast that I think Holst was achieving or trying to achieve.
Okay, so we've talked about the horn extensively. I think that's enough of that. Let's talk about a different instrument. So the B section has a very extensive, beautiful solo for the violin.
Yes.
So what is that about? So same kind of idea of a solo instrument, elevated, totally different key. And by the way, those beautiful median relationships, those beautiful chromatic, like not at all diatonic, not at all like relevant to our understanding of music as an audience, I guess, in terms of like do, re, mi, fa, sol. But so there's a solo violin playing on a contrast with a syncopated rhythm. Again, the woodwinds are doing that job. They are kind of the carpet of the whole thing. They set in motion everything else. What is peaceful about the violin sound, the solo violin?
So, kind of a similar idea to the horn, just in a different timbre. The violin is a very instrumental instrument in the sense that it's meant to be part of a section to really be heard and really like be present in a large orchestra like this. But with the use of the violin and the dropping of all the other strings, it really gives you that sense of like brightness that the instrument has. The violin is a beautiful instrument if you're looking for a really bright and like pingy kind of sound. So I think Holst really played into that with this not only new key signature, but also with this new section that we move up away from. And this is complemented by the low woodwinds that are playing here, because the tessitura of this violin solo sits very high, and right above that we have the syncopated rhythm that's happening in the oboes and the English horns. So those are supplying chords underneath, but not present enough that it gets in the way of the violin. That still stands on its own as its own character.
And there is definitely, I feel that beautiful elevation. It's kind of the apotheosis. It's kind of a small narrative, and we were talking about that a little bit for Mars, but I guess here it's narrating a series of emotions. Like, I mean, Mars has emotions too, but there is kind of an actual story. Here it is like a very beautiful cloud that we're constantly sitting on, pondering on what our life is, and how should we feel. I think that the composer is trying to give us an idea of how those beautiful sounds come together to create something totally new, because then he starts adding a little more of the harp and the celesta, and those instruments did not exist at all in Mars, right? And they exist here. They are signifying something totally different.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And they're definitely used, when they are used in like Mars, they're used completely differently here. So again, you just have a complete change of texture. Now, comparing the Mars, I actually want to bring up something that I thought of when we were listening to the piece just now. So obviously we have completely like opposite ends of the spectrum here. We have Mars, the bringer of peace, or Mars, the bringer of war, and Venus, the bringer of peace, and those happen immediately after each other. So something I noticed when we were listening to this, Nikos, that I was going to tell you about, is the use of syncopation in the middle section of this piece. So it doesn't really happen so much in like the beginning or the end, but in the middle. And I want to talk about that because I personally interpreted that as, when you're at war, like, you're not going to like resolve everything right away. It's always going to take time for it to fully settle in. And I almost believe, or I want to believe, that Holst was challenging that with that sense of syncopation. So, for example, this middle section with the solo violin and then the English horn and oboe playing underneath, like we have this really sense of like we have this sense of beauty and like the chords they're playing and like the melody that we're hearing, but that's almost off put by the syncopated rhythm that the underscored oboe and English horns are playing. So even though it's technically bringing like peace and it sounds peaceful, we're not at that full resolution yet because not everything's lining up rhythmically. Now, when we get to the ending of the piece, this does like go back all together, and all the parts do come back together. But I thought that was really effective how he he made everything sound like it was okay, but it wasn't yet. And almost in the same way that when you're dealing with a conflict with another human being, like things could sound like they're okay, but deep down they're not. I think Holst was trying to channel into that feeling a little bit.
Well, I think you just said it, and I'm going to add just a few things. Number one, this kind of device compositional is a very romantic one. Now, I'm not talking about emotions. I'm talking about like a stylistic era, like the 19th century, the late 19th century. And Holst knows that, and he knows that his audience knows that. They're familiar with Wagnerian works and Brahms and Vaughan Williams and all those folks. Now, you could make a story like that. So the first violin is Venus, is the goddess, like is the bringer of peace, and it's so outlandish. It is so chromatic, so out of this previous like 3 flats. Now we have 5 sharps, 6. Mm-hmm. Wow, 6. And so it's like the whole world stands in awe as the violin enters, and they just can't get their act together as a group. And so there is no harmony, there is peace, but there is no resolution, because that is left to the final elevation. You can't have that's I guess there is some message of peace is not a job for just one element, just one person, just one instrument in that perspective. And then he gives some solos to other instruments as well, and that's kind of a compositional device. But it doesn't matter who it is. All it matters is that there is that sense of ascending, and there is just some sense of it's a work in progress. There is some unified theme of like peaceful, but to varying degrees, right?
Mm-hmm. I think so. And honestly, like I kind of interpret this and this compositional choice as an idea of, almost kind of like metaphor in a very weird way, in the sense of like, like you might be able to convey one emotion, but then you're conveying it another way. So here, like I kind of interpreted this as he's conveying that sense of like peace. And obviously, Venus, as we know, brings that sense of emotion. Like, that's how the history is told. But it doesn't happen right away. And that sense of, like, transition time, like, sticks out to me in a very strange way. I can't really, like, pinpoint how it sticks out to me quite yet. It actually kind of... It kind of challenges a question I was going to ask you, Nikos, at the end of this episode, but I guess I'll just bring it up now. I'm curious to know, and like this goes to any like listeners of this too. Do you think these two movements of this work, Mars, the bringer of war, and Venus, the bringer of peace, can exist without each other? Like, now you can think of this in multiple ways. Like, you can think of this like without the titles. You can think of this without the history. You can think of this without the music. But like, I wonder, like, do you think Holst put these two together purposely, or like, do you think you could take one out for the sake of the experience? I'm kind of interested to know what you think, Nikos.
Well, I think we're talking about 3 different experiences. Like one having the suit as is, one starting right away with Venus, or just omitting that, and going on without it. Those two have that beautiful contrast to each other, and in the long term of the 7 movement work, you would feel that eventually. You can feel it right away. This is kind of a symphony with the first movement, which is fast and rigorous, and the second movement, which is kind of an adagio or andante, which is essentially what that is. There are some elements that are common. There are some ostinati like in the tin, trin, 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 in this movement,
right,
like in the same way that existed in the previous one, but not in the same affect, in the same mood. So I think that the best way to listen to this music is actually what the composer intended, and I love works that are so purposeful and they're put together like there is a big picture at the end. There's like a pot at the end of a rainbow.
Yeah, no, I definitely could see that perspective a lot, especially because when we first started like, planning this podcast and started planning what we were going to talk about, Nikos was telling me how some orchestras that have done this piece, they actually omit the last three movements.
So in the past, they some performers, some conductors stopped at Jupiter, which is kind of a jolly. It's the bringer of jollity. So that gave the movement, that gave the work a happy ending, and the composer didn't really like that. We're gonna talk about that in our Jupiter episode and in our final episode. But just for now, it's important to know that the composer just wanted every time his work intact. Like, don't change anything.
Yeah, Holst was very particular, and like this is by no means any exception to that rule. Yeah, so I guess one other thing that really stuck out to me on this last listen through was just the use of chords that he really had here. So Nikos referenced one already, like the use of like that bum 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 in like the chords that Holst was building underneath. But really, this kind of captured my attention because one of the big points that we made in the last episode about Mars was the choice of chords and how a lot of them were built on like uncomfortable intervals such as tritones, and a lot of them were built on like chords or intervals such as fourths or fifths, or just open chords that have like this like hollow kind of empty sound to them. But here now we're presented with much more harmonic intervals that like you more commonly hear. So like major thirds, major sixths, sometimes minor third, minor sixth, like the relative minors of those. I find that very interesting. I don't know if like Holst heard those intervals as a sign of peace as opposed to the ones he used before. But it's interesting to see that dynamic shift, especially coming from just a solo instrument and then playing these chords, like kind of plunking them out below that.
And exactly there's your metaphor for that. Big fourth chords, hollow chords, a sense of fear, a sense of like, what is there? Density, intimacy, right? We know where we are. It's a little more diatonic. It's kind of chromatic at the same time. It's not placed every time like in sense of like, okay, 1, 4, 5 or whatever. But it's kind of still static is what I'm saying. But it's more intimate. It's in a different register. It's going somewhere. It's not a big, powerful ostinato. And probably is that a metaphor for peace being really the answer to war? Those kinds of chords being the answer to the open fourth chords. That's kind of a philosophical question to ponder on, but that's what we're here for.
Yes, absolutely. And actually, it's interesting that you mentioned that. Like, we had so many like use of like perfect fourths in the first movement, and now it almost feels like they are resolved, thus bringing that peace. Kind of reminds me of Frozen 2, the whole message behind Into the Unknown, which is exactly what the first movement was trying to encompass. That sense of uncertainty, that sense of harshness, that living through any type of war, any type of heavy conflict like that was being experienced. But now we're being presented with this idea of peace. So in the same way that the music has, in those like open intervals have resolved down, so has the peace. But yet we don't get there quite all the way yet. So like I was saying before, I think Holst really tried to play into that sense of like it takes time to recover and heal from those. So he uses things like syncopation and rhythmic displacement. Despite everything harmonically sounding more resolved, he uses that sense of displacement to show that we're not there yet, but then we get there in the ending.
And there's still, as you said, we haven't resolved the conflict completely, and I think only in the end of the movement, and probably not completely even then. I mean, even the violin solo in the B section, in the middle section of the piece, is kind of a sorrowful. It's actually resolving into D sharp. What is it? D sharp minor, which is a mediant relationship to the beginning of the piece from the F.
Right.
And so that is still kind of like a melancholy there, and it only resolves into the heavens of the very high violin register, the celesta, the harp, instruments that he uses. And again, this is kind of a romantic device that he knows, that his audience knows, and everybody knows what he's talking about. It's kind of a collective experience based on metaphors, which are set it up before his time, even many years before his time, but he uses them in a way that's very convincing and very organic in his own music.
Absolutely. This was a very beautiful movement to listen to. Literally, we were listening to this, and the first thing we said at the end was like, "That was very cute." It's very adorable, and like it really just goes to show you like how different like a compositional device can change things. You know, like Nikos was just saying, like we ended in this really high tessitura that represents the heavens. But then we start the first movement with these low tessitura notes, like bum 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 bum, like, and then we're like, it almost kind of like represents like hell in a really weird, kind of eerie kind of way. So it's interesting to see what Holst was thinking about, and clearly, like he was trying his best to say, do not separate these movements or do not stop in the middle, go all the way through for like the true experience.
So yeah, I guess the last metaphor, and we're gonna close with that. We're gonna leave you with that thought: is war is something that's really bound, probably binding, like aggravating people, like binding them down to earth. Peace, on the other hand, is resolved way up high. It's kind of an elevating experience for the soul, for the humans, for the audience, for the conductor, for the players, for everybody involved. It's something that it's out of the human register. It's out of the human experience. It's something that it's above us, but yet it's attainable. I mean, we can hear it, we can see it in front of us, and that's again, I guess, the point that he wanted to make, that peace is something that is higher than us, higher than our understanding. But if we really try hard, we can attain it.
100%, Nikos. I believe that's our time for episode 2. Thank you all so much for tuning in. My name is Nick.
My name is Nikos.
Thank you all for listening. We will see you episode 3, where we talk about the winged messenger, Mercury. Should be a very interesting episode, considering that now these first 3 movements are all very different from one another. So stay tuned. Thank you everyone for tuning in today, and we will talk to you again soon.
See ya.